So as of this year, I've owned this C5 Corvette for almost 9 years. I've put roughly 80,000 miles on it. Let's talk about it. What did it cost? How was it? Would I do it again? Here I have a stack of receipts. So this is basically not everything I've done to the car because I can't find all of the receipts for the car. Because I've owned it so long, they've been sent to different emails or different filing systems, and I couldn't pull everything up, but we're only going to cover the things that are actually required to keep the car going. So obviously, if you've watched any of my videos, the car is very heavily modified. It is a heads cam intake build. I've done a lot of preventative maintenance in the guise of reliability, because to me, my time is valuable. I like to go out and do things and not worry about it. I like taking the car to the track and not having to worry about it. There is absolutely nothing more frustrating in that realm of activities than spending $400 on a DE and going to the track and having a break early, or just constantly battling issues all day. It will absolutely ruin your day. You'll feel like you wasted $400. You won't have any fun. So I try to avoid those things. I don't do a great job at it, but I try to avoid it. So this car was my daily for a number of years, like from 2016 when I bought it until probably 2020 when my job went work from home. I stopped driving it every day, and I bought a beater at that point. But I did drive 1,500 to 2,000 miles a month to and from work, not including other activities. Like I lived 25, 30 miles away from work both ways every day. So that was a lot. And because of that, the car did chew through consumables. Like obviously, we're not going to do brake pads in this video. We're not going to do oil changes, that kind of stuff. I think I put 2 sets of pads on it. That was maybe $100, and 2 sets of rotors until I started tracking it. Once you start tracking it, all that goes out the window because it doesn't matter anymore. Same thing with tires. I changed wheels frequently enough that it didn't really make much of a difference. I never wore a set of tires down to the cords, but I changed wheels frequently enough that it constantly had new tires on it. But anyway, we'll start from the beginning. What was the first thing that broke on the car? So the first thing that broke, I guess one other thing we should mention, partially again because I've owned the car so long, there are some things that I've done more than once. We'll take that into consideration for however you want to do it. Whatever you take from this video, take what I say and think about it. So the first thing that ever broke on the car during my ownership was the AC compressor. It actually locked up completely. It made a little bit of noise, and then the AC stopped blowing, so I ran it without the AC on for the most part. But we had one day where it was like blazing hot. And if you've ever been in one of these cars, they get extremely hot inside. Just the way you're positioned, the car still had cats at the time, the way the cats are positioned, the way the torque tube comes up next to you, like they are always hot. It just is what it is. The C6s are just as bad. It's just a Corvette thing. So the first thing that went bad was the AC compressor. I put a new OEM AC compressor on it because that is very hard to get to, and at the time it was $400 from the Chevy dealer, and then it was $100 in Freon, so not a big deal. It bills 4 hours labor, so you'll have to figure out what your labor rate is for whatever shop you plan on doing. I do everything myself, so I don't pay the labor rate, but at our shop, 4 hours would be $600. So that would have been a $1,000 repair. That new OEM AC compressor locked up within 10,000 miles. So then I put a Napa Gold AC compressor on it instead. That way I could get paid to do it over for warranty if it ever broke again, and it has been fine ever since. That was $240. Same thing, recharge the Freon and all that. That was $100 for the Freon with labor. So there's that. So far, you take that how you want, either $1,000 or $650 for the compressor clutch. But you could live without that. You know, like technically speaking, you don't need that, but I like stuff in my cars to work. So there was that. That is receipt number 1. And it took roughly 40,000 miles for that to break. Other than that, the car was pretty sound. It did have some stability control codes that I never worried about. They are very common in C5s. If you're thinking about buying one, that is something you should consider. They do have a lot of issues with the ABS module. It's very well documented. My advice would be buy an 01 or later. Just in general, if you're in the market for C5, 01 and later. So after that, the car was pretty stout. It did at one point have a slave cylinder failure, and it was no longer fully extending. I don't know what exactly happened. That also happened right around 110,000 miles. Or that happened around 100. That was shortly after I did the AC compressor. So I bought the full TIC Performance clutch kit at that point. That came with McLeod RST, their adjustable master cylinder, a new OEM, which I've since found out I don't think we're actually OEM slave cylinder. It's OEM style, but I don't think it's a real GM slave cylinder. One of those. I did the torque tube at that point, and that total was $1,891 for the full TIC kit. This was in 2018, so prices have probably gone up since then. That was for a McLeod RST with aluminum flywheel. I paid the extra to get it balanced. I got the billet alignment tool. I got everything. Obviously, you could do that cheaper, and we billed 15 hours labor. So again, that would be basically 150 times 15 is what, $1,750 roughly. Significant repair. So roughly $4,000 if you were to pay somebody to do that, not including your fluids and stuff. Could I have just done the slave? Yes. If you ever pull a transmission out of this, you will very quickly understand why it would make no sense to do that, especially on a car with the mileage. It had roughly 100,000 miles on it at that point. It would also just make sense to do the clutch while you're there. So that was like the only big repair I had to do on the car at that point. And you could have gone cheaper. You can get an OEM LS7 clutch and all OEM hydraulics from GM for less than $1,000, I think. Even with a new flywheel, I think it would run you less than $1,200. So there are things you could do to save money. Like I said, I did a lot of things under the idea that I will overbuild it and make it more reliable. I will overcompensate where I need to make sure I don't have problems in the future. That bites me in the ass a lot. Take from that what you will. But yeah, so that's what we did. After that, it was good for about 10,000 more miles. The car definitely had been neglected before. Like the times I'd had the valve covers off because I checked for the bad springs and everything. They were definitely dirty. Like it didn't have the best maintenance schedule in its previous life. And even once I owned it before I rebuilt the engine, I was not as diligent about oil changes as I probably should have been. I never ran thousands of miles over, but I did push it to the full 7,500 miles almost every time. So from a combination of those things and just GM engines doing what they do, I did have a lifter start to freeze up at that point, and it would squeak. It would only squeak when it was cold. That escalated to it squeaked all the time, to then, okay, it's got misfires because the lifter's squeaking. So at that point, that was the second major repair that happened at 110,000 miles, 623 miles. So again, just like the clutch, you kind of have options at that point. You could very easily, would not be best practice, you could just put a new lifter in it. The fact that it was misfiring kind of told me it was wearing the cam out. Because if you've ever seen when a lifter fails, it'll lock the roller up and just ride and grind into the top of the camshaft lobe. It's obviously not ideal. So because of that, I had to do lifters in the cam. Lifters were $150 at that point. You could still get GM Performance lifters for cheap at that point from the Chevy dealer. That has since changed. So a cam and lifters would run you $800, and at that point you might as well do valve springs as well. We billed 15 hours labor for that as well, if that's how I were to do it, but I did not do it that way. So that's kind of what we're getting into. That's why this became a heads cam intake build. I rebuilt the full bottom end, new oil pump, new everything. I didn't need to do that. It just felt like the right thing to do at the time. So that's what I did. The total of the engine build and the headers and everything I did in a previous video. If you look, I think I did that around 2020 when I put it all together. The total build, including the clutch, the tuning, and everything, was roughly 10 grand. And I think I've made another video since then of would I do it again, but that is also part of my plan for tonight while I'm filming all these videos. So total, and here's the other thing. Total so far, another $2,500 to put into the car. So far we're at almost $7,000 in maintenance and repairs if you're paying a shop to do the work at $150 an hour. I'll put a Google sheet at the end of this or in the description with actual numbers because I'm just kind of rounding in my head right now. In hindsight, when I had the transmission and torque tube out and I rebuilt the torque tube and I did the clutch and everything, I could have done a cam at the same time. When you do stuff on these cars, it is fairly easy to just lift the body off both subframes and then you have free reign to do whatever you want. Could have saved money there, maybe not. I didn't know it was going to need a cam at that point. It was on my list of things, like I had always wanted to do it. Like I think everyone knew a cam and headers, you know, full bolt-on cam and full bolt-on LS6 car is a pretty stout car with a tune. It wasn't really in the budget, and it was my only car, so I wanted to keep it kind of daily driver friendly. And yeah, I don't totally know why I didn't do it at that point. I think that was why, because it was my only car, but would have kind of made sense to do it. I could have addressed a lot of things while the rear, like dropped both subframes, addressed everything. The car did have some oil leaks, but they weren't significant. It just, the lower oil pan leaked. It's very common on these. But at that point, at 110,000 miles, I'd put 50,000 miles on the car, roughly at that point. Probably closer to 45. I bought the car with like 64,000. $7,000 in maintenance, like major repairs, for 50,000 miles is not that bad on a car like this. Food for thought. But after that, that's when it starts to snowball. So I think everyone knows once you start really heavily modifying cars, that's when things get expensive. So a lot of these costs, you know, from this point on, partially self-inflicted, like if we're going to be totally honest. It did have a fuel pump die at one point, so I put an Aeromotive 340 in it because it was heads cam intake. That was $130, half hour labor, so $75, not a big deal. On an 03, an early 03 or earlier, the fuel pump is very easy to do. If you have a late 03, there's a VIN number cutoff that you can look up if you're curious. Late 03 to 04, they are C6 style tanks. The pumps are on the top. You have to drop the subframe, you have to drop the tanks, change the pump at the top. It sucks. I think on a C5 with the early style pump, it comes out the bottom of the tank like this way. I bet you could do it on the ground. You might have to jack the car up a little bit. You can do it on the ground. You don't need a lift or anything. It's a quick job. That was a big relief because I knew 03s could have the sucky tank. So that's what I did. That was cool. One of the cheaper repairs, so we're like $7,100. Now at some point the diff started to make noise. And that was kind of a tricky situation because I think what it had turned out was it had always made noise. Since I bought the car, around 125,000 miles is when the diff went out. It made some crazy noises, crazy squealing noises, on throttle, off throttle. It resonated through the torque tube. I'll put the clip in here of what happened.
Guess I just found the problem.
They're gonna be rebuildable.
I guess we'll see what happens inside.
I hope so.
The short side axle, like the short axle stub, what I've heard people call the weak side, that lost its bearing for support and it started wobbling and it made all kinds of crazy noises. It sounded like a pinion bearing, but it wasn't. I think that had been wearing the majority of the time I had the car. These cars have tons of road noise, and I had written it off as tire noise the whole time. Even when I had all seasons, I always had pretty wide tires. They made a lot of noise. It's kind of hard to differentiate sometimes. I think it turned out to be diff noise. So fortunately for me, we had the toolkit to rebuild it. The rebuild kit with all the bearings and everything was $207, and we charged 4 hours labor to it. So it's $800 to rebuild the diff. Now, had that diff not been in rebuildable condition, I would have had to swap in a spare diff. They're available used for a variety of prices. I did have a spare as a core that I had planned on putting a 390 in and rebuilding it and swapping in that I picked up for $100. They're usually not that cheap, but used diff could be a good price or a good option. Because of how the C5 diffs are set up and the C6 diffs even are set up, there is a special toolkit you need. And setting up is a very long process. It's not like a regular, solid axle. So there was that. So $8,000 so far, 60,000 miles. Still really not all that bad. So then at that point, I think this was sort of self-inflicted. we pulled it when we did the diff. We pulled the transmission out. We pulled the whole thing out because the transmission mount also broke, which was $100 for a new OEM one. I never put a solid transmission mount on these because I didn't want the NVH. But when we did that and we put the torque tube back in, we put the torque tube in with the diff and transmission assembled and put the whole subframe in. I think we damaged the pilot bearing, and the pilot bearing started to make noise. So all of it ended up coming back out. I chewed the pilot bearing up and like really tore it up. It tore up the input shaft or the input shaft for the torque tube, to the point where it kind of machined the end. All the bearings fell out. Same thing. I can put the clip here if I... Yeah, she's fucked. Get all the pieces of the fucking bearing out. Shit. That'll make some not good noises for sure. But regardless of if it was self-inflicted or not, this was kind of a pain in the ass. Anytime you have to take that out, it's a big deal. It bills like 15 hours. So anytime the torque tube comes out and you're paying somebody to do it and they're not doing it under warranty like this, we probably would have done under warranty because we had just had it out and it started making noise like 500 miles later. Like that's something we would have covered. But because of that, I had to buy a new input shaft. The OEM ones are discontinued. I didn't like the idea of a used one, so I had to buy a $250 input shaft plus a $30 pilot bearing. So $280 plus another 15 hours labor. It adds up. It's roughly $2,000 in labor. So that put us up to like 12 grand, but again, self-inflicted, kind of different. I put another 10,000 miles on it or so, and then we started having first gear engagement problems. I took that as an opportunity because the car had a ton of miles on it. The transmission had never been rebuilt. It was always hard to downshift into first gear, which very rarely do you do anyway, but it was hard. It was hard to get into reverse. I took that as an opportunity to get the transmission rebuilt. So this was sort of optional because I didn't really break the transmission. But I thought maybe my first gear engagement problem was transmission related because the clutch was relatively new. So it turned out it was actually a clutch problem. And the clutch I had put in, I guess I skipped a step. At one of these points when the torque tube was out, I sent the McLeod clutch back to McLeod. They offer a refresh program where they replace the pressure plate, replace the friction discs, clean everything. You pay them like basically 50% of a new clutch, but they put it all back together and send it to you. The one I got back was defective or something, and it never fully engaged the second plate. That was actually the cause of the first gear engagement problem, but I didn't know that at the time. So I paid to get the transmission rebuilt. I replaced the whole first gear assembly, like the gear, the synchro, everything, the slider. All the bearings were done. The bearings had made noise in neutral the entire time I owned the car up to that point. It never heard anything, but it did make a crazy like wub 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 sound if you were idling and the car was in neutral, and like the counter shaft I guess was just spinning without the balance of the or the input shaft was spinning without being connected to the counter shaft, I guess. I don't know. That was $2,000 plus the labor to reinstall it. It was out for something else. Not really the end of the world, but had you not done that, had you not taken the option to rebuild it, it's $4,000. So that puts us up to like 16. So we're in the car, like basically what I paid for it. I paid 22 for the car in 2016. So then at that point, everything was cool. Like it was actually pretty good for like 20,000 miles. Like at that point, we finally had it sorted, I think. And the car was fun. It did a couple Tail of the Dragon trips. It did 2 seasons of track days. This last season is when things really started to like kind of fall apart. So I spun on the track. I went off in the gravel or in the grass, bumped around a lot. I think that bouncing and everything moved my remote bleeder, my tick remote bleeder, and it hit my header. And it didn't burn through right away. I was able to drive the car a few miles, go get lunch, come back, pull into the track, go to park, and my clutch pedal goes to the floor. Thought that was weird. Kind of knew at that point I was stuck. I wasn't going to be able to leave. But I parked, I popped the hood to see what happens, big fireball comes out. Put the fire out, and at that point, obviously, with that line being burned through, and every time you push the clutch, it's squirting hot fluid onto the header, that's game over. So I had to get towed home, and we did the clutch another time. I went back to all LS7 stuff at that point. So again, optional, didn't have to do that. You could just replace the speed bleeder for $35, but again, self-inflicted. If we're talking things that I absolutely had to do to the car in this 80,000 miles I owned it, it's less than $10,000, which I actually think is pretty impressive, to this point at least. So then after that, it seemed like the car just had really bad luck, or maybe I had really bad parts. My alternator died. The alternators for these cars are special. Somehow they're like early pulse width modulated alternators, and there's two different part numbers. One is cheap and one is expensive. This car takes the expensive alternator. That was $625. That was not fun. The alternator also died on the way back from the track, so I had to get towed home again. That same day I was at the track, my starter died, and I had been pop starting it all day, which made me think there must be some kind of electrical gremlin going on, because it didn't make sense that I would kill both components in one day. But it seems like I did. So I checked all my grounds. I did a bunch of diagnostic, trying to figure out, like, was there some kind of electrical thing going on? I never found anything. So the starter and the alternator were $1,000 because I bought a Bosch new starter. I didn't want to reman. Like, this car with the headers and everything, you have to take the header off. You have to pull it out the top. You have to take the whole X pipe off. There's no changing a starter easily. It adds at least an hour to it. So the alternator and the starter would have been 3 hours labor at $1,000, so $1,450. That puts us up to $9,500, I think, of like absolute, like, you have to fix this to fix the car. I keep driving it. Not really that awful. Had I not done a lot of optional stuff and not built the car and tried to modify it, we're talking like less than a little over $1,000 a year to own it, which is not bad at all. And then on Christmas, my starter died again, but it was covered under warranty. So there's that. So total, like, really not bad. Would I do it again? I don't know. I don't think they're bad cars at all by any means. They are very good cars. They're very reliable if you don't mess with them too much and you don't beat on them too much. But the reality of it is, they're old cars. You know, this car is a 2003. That is 22 years old. That is a classic in a lot of states. And the early C5s are almost 30 years old. You know, 1997 was 28 years ago. Like, they're classic cars effectively at this point, which is really crazy to think about. But they come with classic car problems. Like, they're old. When stuff is old, it just breaks. The same reason I stopped driving my 3rd gen Trans Ams as my dailies was because they were also at that point, you know, 25 years old. The stuff just breaks when it's that old. And you start running into, okay, it's hard to get parts for these now. The base C5s, I think, are a lot easier, especially the 01 and later cars. But there are a lot of like weird Z06 specific things that are actually kind of tricky to find. Like the upper window seals that go from the windshield up over the door, that is your windshield seal, and they're discontinued from the OEMs. There's someone making aftermarket ones now. I haven't seen any to like judge them, but the seals that are on those window seals go bad, and these cars will leak profusely from the windshield because you'd think the hardtop would leak less than the target top, but that's not at all the case in a lot of these cars. Had to learn that the hard way. And there'll be another video about things I wish I knew when I bought my C5 Corvette that I'll probably post in the near future. But, you know, like that kind of stuff's hard to find. The rear window glass is hard to find. The rear window molding, hard to find. The front window molding, like it goes over the windshield, impossible to find. Pretty much anything that was Z06 or FRC specific is extremely hard to find because they just didn't make that many. You know, even if they made 5-to-1 spares for every part, which I doubt they did, it's been 20-something years since they made those cars. Like, it's been a long time. It's hard to find stuff. So, do I regret it? No, not at all. Like, it was a really cool daily. They are fairly practical. They're good on gas. I mean, like, in the perspective of impractical sports cars, they're good on gas. This car would get in the mid-20s on the highway, without a doubt, if not upper 30s if you stayed out of it. Around town, they'd get like closer to 17 to 18, but for what it is, I don't think that's bad. obviously only seats 2 people, but you can fit a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot of storage space in this whole area. Basically, the whole rear of the car is storage. There's little tubs for where the subframes are, but there's tons of space. You can roll the seats forward. You can tuck stuff in from the front. Like I moved out of 3 different like dorm apartments in this car because I ended up when I was in college. I put TVs in here, all my clothes, and like I pack a little light, but what else do you really need when you're that young? It's always cool to pick people up in it. Like everyone was sort of excited, except for people that like weren't into cars. They're like, "Why do you drive this? Why is that so low? Like, why is that so loud?" But I don't have any regrets. I don't think. I just think now they're too old to practically do that again. You know, in 2016 when I bought it, this was only a 13-year-old car. The C5 had only been out of production for 12 years. Now they've been out of production for like 21. Yeah, it's actually like a pretty big difference when you really think about it. Like this car was as old as a C7 was when I bought it compared to now. When you really like think of it in that perspective, like that it changes a little bit. You know, it's like this is 3 generations old now. This would have been like if I bought a C4 Corvette and was like, oh, I'm gonna daily it. Like, could you do it? Probably. Was it a good idea? Probably not. I don't know what I would recommend instead though. I don't think, and I've always thought this, like every time I've wanted to sell this car, there is nothing at the price point of these cars that gives you the performance for the dollar. And I mean, is an E46 M3 nicer? Probably. Like the interior is way nicer. They probably ride better. They perform similar even with less power, at least on track, like not in a straight line obviously, but then you get all the BMW stuff. You get the BMW prices, you get the BMW issues, you get all the E46 issues like the subframes, you know, auto ejecting and stuff like that. The rod bearing maintenance, like stuff that you don't have to consider on a Corvette because at the end of the day, it's an LS engine. And you can make the argument that a truck engine's iron, it's not an LS engine, but at the same time, they share the same architecture. It's a very robust platform. There's a lot of interchange, and a lot of interchange means a lot of others pieces are made, which gets you some economies of scale and stuff is cheaper. Like there's not much more you could want. Consumables were cheap other than tires. Like tires are big, so they're expensive, but the brakes are cheap. Like there's not a lot left on the table for one of these. You know, like they are very good cars. Yeah, that's what it cost me to own it for roughly 9 years. So I'll put a little spreadsheet here, and I'll put it in Google Drive if anyone wants to see it. So thank you for watching. I hope this was insightful and maybe it makes an influence on somebody's decision on if they want to buy a C5 or not.